I'm very pleased to be here and to see so many friends in the audience, friends here from the United States and also from Europe and from Africa and from around the world. I've chosen as my title, Reimagining Philanthropy, Partnerships and Poverty in a Global Age. As some of you know, a few months ago I announced that I would be retiring as president of the Rockefeller Foundation at the end of this year. And since then I've noticed a surprising and I must say rather disturbing pattern, and that is many people seem to be very supportive of this decision. I appreciate that, but my paranoid side is also reminded of a line attributed to Samuel Johnson. He said, "A man who announces his retirement gains many supporters, but this is because the retiree is laying himself down as voluntary prey." And I have to say I have no interest in being voluntary prey, and all the vultures in the audience can back off. I want to be provocative. I want to take this time with you to reflect seriously on the state of our work and the choices I believe we face. It's a broad topic, and I've only got a few minutes, although I've gained 5, I notice, which is rather nice. Thank you, Jane, for that. I want to describe how I see the world and hope that it stimulates discussion. And I've entitled the first part of my remarks, Reimagining Systems of Opportunity. Let me explain why. As everyone here knows, the context of and the practice of philanthropy has changed dramatically. The world of even 15 years ago is gone forever. As recently as the 1980s, the world economic systems were fairly clear. Nation states controlled borders, most businesses operated within those borders, importing or exporting from them. International institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, created almost exclusively after World War II, mediated between nation states, helping to diffuse tensions on everything from monetary policy to movements of refugees. That was the context within which philanthropies operated. It was difficult, but orderly. And 3 new forces have disturbed the old world, the old order. First, of course, global economics. Nation states continue to have power over their borders, but global capitalism has meant that they have lost real power over multinational companies. These companies have considerable means to do business wherever they choose in the world. Second, of course, is the access to information. The breakdown of the old context has been fueled by the development of information technologies. Regulatory systems used to own information. Citizens used to depend on relatively few localized sources for facts. But a funny thing happened on the way to the information revolution. Citizens of the world can now choose to listen to whoever they wish, whether it be Al Jazeera or MTV. The result is complex, arguably a system that is at once more global, yet at the same time more fragmented than ever before. And finally, we must recognize the role of the United States as the sole superpower. Multilateral international institutions that formerly helped knit feuding parties together now face the fact that the United States is strong enough to attempt unilateral action in contexts that once might have given it greater pause. I don't want to make any value judgments here, only that the reality of US behavior has affected the expectations of organizations like the United Nations as well as its participants. Those of us who set out to help the poor, like the Rockefeller Foundation where I work, must understand this new world and, I believe, reimagine the systems that we need to create that will expand opportunity and hence will reduce poverty. How do we deal with this new environment? I think there are 3 approaches that one can envision. One system rests on the notion of hierarchical structures, much like the one we've employed for the last 60 years. National governments are in charge of their territory, businesses are regulated within it, foundations and philanthropies sponsor community activities approved by governments or in conjunction with governments that help poor and sick people. It's an approach that has several characteristics. There are relatively few players, the interaction is easy to sketch out, 2 or 3 dimensions at most, and the resources come from philanthropy and go directly to a party that then interacts with the target group. I don't want to diminish this approach. Excellent work of this kind is being done in communities across the globe, and philanthropy can take some credit for the vibrancy of civil society today. But I don't believe that this approach can be the sole avenue of promoting social change. The world simply is not constructed on that axis anymore. Hierarchical approaches are not built to deal with global information age systems. A second approach acknowledges that the world has changed, but opts to maintain a laser-like focus on what a specific philanthropy can do. And I call this approach anarchy, not to be pejorative, but simply because I want to point out it envisions hundreds or even thousands of different players all acting on their own. I would argue that this is actually the system that we're following today. In every developing country now, there are tens of development agencies and hundreds, if not thousands, of development projects. And no one is coordinating this work. Instead, nation states, philanthropies, international institutions, business entities, non-profits are all looking at situations, deciding what they think should be done, and then for the most part, acting directly to try and solve the problem. And that's why I call it anarchy. And I don't think it's working particularly well. By now you'll have recognized that I'm echoing the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and the question now is, what's the third approach? And surprise, surprise, the third approach is the theme of this conference, partnerships. But I don't mean any old partnership. That's a British vernacular expression which I can't translate into American. Nor do I mean partnerships where the more partners, the merrier. Partnerships are not parties. And I think in particular what we're talking about here are partnerships that bring together the 3 great sectors in our economies: the private sector, the public sector, and the community-based sector. And I think the essence of the partnerships that we're trying to create are partnerships that harness the innovativeness and enterprise of the private sector with the scale and political clout of the public sector and the power of self-help and commitment of the community-based sector. Innovativeness, scale, self-help and commitment. The 3 attributes of those three sectors that we are trying to harness together. And of course, creating such partnerships is not easy. It requires brokers and facilitators that are respected, that carry weight, and are neutral. And that, I think, describes the key role of philanthropy in the 21st century. Philanthropy as a persuader that will bring different actors together to implement solutions. Over the past 10 years at the Rockefeller Foundation, we've created more than a dozen such major partnerships. Lots of minor ones too, but about a dozen big ones in health and in agriculture, and also here in the United States in housing and employment. Many people don't realize just how many public-private partnerships that are going on here in the US. The biggest that we're involved in is Living Cities, which is working in 23 cities in the United States to create affordable housing and economic development. It has, at the moment, over $120 million for the first 3 years of its work from foundations, banks, and the government. Major, probably the biggest public-private partnership in the world. Based on the experience of these public-private partnerships and observing the experiences of other actors, I've compiled a set of concepts we use in examining partnerships, a set of 6 rules for the road, which I want to go through. First, before creating a partnership, one must be very clear about the nature of the problem, its structure, its dynamics, and its context. In the Rockefeller Foundation, we call that creating a problématique. It's a French word, I'm afraid, but it's a very good word, and it doesn't have an English translation. I shouldn't make jokes like that, I know. But it's like entrepreneur, another great American phrase. You need to understand the problem, structure, dynamics, context, and have a fairly deep understanding of who holds pieces of the answer. Without a clear definition of the problem, it's simply too easy for a partnership to lose its way. The fact that partners get along is nice, but it's not enough. Second rule of the road. The sponsors of the effort need to think outside the box about what options exist and be willing to give up control to multiple players. Partnerships are needed precisely because an obvious answer, providing a drug or a foodstuff or affordable housing, directly hasn't worked. Partnerships are about tough problems, and partnering is a tough challenge, both emotionally and intellectually. Third rule. Control must in part be in the hands of the real stakeholders, i.e. the poor, whether they be in the industrialized part of the world or the developing world. In the hands of those communities of poor and excluded people we're trying to assist. Only in this way will the partners keep their eye on the goal, their eye on the prize. Multiple partners need multiple agendas. But ultimately, the people who have the problem must have a genuine decision-making authority. Fourth rule. The goal of a partnership needs to be concrete. And I define this as the provision of what I would call affordable goods and services. There has to be a clear bottom line to a partnership, a physical good or an institutional service. It can be housing. It can be the provision of education, healthcare, childcare, transportation. In Africa, a vaccine or a drug against HIV/AIDS, or a new crop variety for poor farmers. Or it can mean opportunities for creative expression, for connection to a wider society. But it has to be something there that you can really appreciate when you've got it, that you, in a sense, you can nearly touch it. In some cases, you can touch it. You can take the medicine in your hand. You can put your hand on the front door of the house. This is my new house. This is the medicine that's going to keep me alive for the rest of my life. That's the bottom line. Fifthly, partnerships are about deal-making. At the start, Each of the partners needs to know what they're going to get. The whole world doesn't need to be in on the negotiation, but the partners need to understand what each party needs and hopes to achieve. I will put in this, you will put in that. At the end, I will get this, you will get that, but we are fully agreed that we will have together achieved the provision of this or that good or service that is affordable and accessible to poor and excluded people. Without a deal, we just get a lot of nice talk and a lot of good, comfortable feeling. When you've got a deal, it hasn't necessarily been comfortable, but you've really achieved something. And that brings me to the sixth and most difficult concept for successful partnerships, which comes from the fact that philanthropies in partnerships need to understand different motivations. At the moment, we tend to see the world, through the prism of altruism. We tend to say what's wrong, what can be done to fix it, to make it right. But this is not enough. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for success. Partnerships are not primarily about charity. We need to understand a hard lesson. Moral reasoning may show us the problem, but in this new world, it can lead us to inadequate solutions. In a world of successful partnerships, many, if not most of our partners will be governed by self-interest. And our task is to harness these different interests towards common goals. For the Rockefeller Foundation, all of this means a further step in our philanthropy as imagined by our founder, John D. Rockefeller. He knew the foundation would be an outstanding asset in the world. He saw it would be a force for good and help throughout the United States and the globe in perpetuity. And we believe we are faithful to our donors' intent. But in the 21st century, foundations can be no substitute for government, no substitute for the private sector, or for numerous government and community-based organizations. Instead, used wisely, we can use our assets to bring various actors together, to experiment, to stimulate innovation. In short, to broker change in ways that individually each of the actors may find difficult. Well, I hope what I've done there is to lay out a rather controversial position. I've spoken very bluntly. I hope it will stimulate discussion. What I now have to do is to move over here and to get my two panelists to join me for the panel session. Thank you. We now have 50 minutes for this panel. I have joined by two terrific panelists. They're going to speak, I'm going to ask them questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for probably the last 20 minutes or so, see how we move along. I have on my right Zeda Rosenberg, who is the chief executive of the International Partnership for Microbicides. She started off life as a virologist, worked on leukemia in cats. Many of you may think that's a rather obscure, abstruse topic, but it turns out leukemia in cats is very similar to HIV in humans. She worked for many years at the National Institute of Health, was one of the pioneers of work in microbicides. She then went on to the Family Health Institute, and there she was scientific director of the HIV prevention trials for a number of years, and I'm delighted to say she was willing to be arm-twisted into becoming CEO of IPM in 2002. I'm going to introduce Eugene after Zeda's spoken, but I want Zeda now to tell you a little bit about what microbicides are, because most of you, my guess is, don't know what they are, and to talk about IPM. Zeda, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And we weren't going to use slides, but I always like to start these things up with this great, beautiful Scientific American slide of the vagina, which usually gets everybody's attention, no matter where we are, because it really is very important to understand female anatomy in order to understand what microbicides are. But the bottom line is that these are future products that are future technology for HIV prevention for women, particularly in the developing world, but throughout the world, who don't have control over when, where, and whether they have sex. And these are designed to prevent HIV infection, and which, as most of you are well aware, is an incredible epidemic throughout the world, and that women are particularly at risk for infection. And that is because they're at risk both biologically, they get more virus than men do per sex act, and also politically. They oftentimes can't negotiate condoms, which are the only known HIV prevention technology. And young women, we know, are an incredibly large growing population of women at risk. And that is because younger women in their teens are, again, biologically more vulnerable to HIV infection. The vagina hasn't matured yet and is more easily damaged during sex, and the virus can gain easier access. So for a variety of reasons, all of these factors have combined to make women the most rapidly growing population of HIV-infected people in the world. So they need prevention technologies, and microbicides can be thought of, because you say, well, what would they look like? They could be either gels or creams or vaginal films or sponges or intravaginal rings that can deliver HIV drugs or that can prevent the entry of the virus into the body. Sometimes they might be designed to prevent a local infection from becoming a systemic infection. But the goal is to keep the woman uninfected and alive. So that is our mission, and it's pretty direct. Let me see. And currently, we often get some concerns about, well, won't this enhance high-risk activity if you have something like this, and what about abstinence and behavior change and condoms? And I've already told you why condoms won't work. And abstinence is not an option for women many times in many places, and right now women's greatest risk factor throughout the world for getting infected is being married. So therefore ABC is not going to work. Okay, so the mission of the IPM is to accelerate the development and access to microbicides for the prevention of HIV infection for women in resource-poor settings. The history of this field is that it came into kind of attention in the late 80s, mainly by women's reproductive health advocates who saw the writing on the wall very early on and said, what is happening, who is designing and thinking about women and their increased risk? And at that point in time, there was early indications that an HIV vaccine was not going to be easy. You know, the virus was discovered in '84. Everyone thought we'd have a vaccine in a few years, and by '89, '90, it was clear that the more work that was being done on a vaccine, the more technological issues arose. And we're now 2004, and we're still trying to deal with those technological issues. And that is not to say that, that a vaccine should not be as vigorously pursued as it is, and even to a much greater extent. But it is clear that there has to be kind of an assortment of prevention technologies, just the way the influenza vaccine isn't kind of considered alone something that's going to control an epidemic. You need to wash your hands, you need to throw away tissues. The same thing for malaria, the same thing for all kinds of infectious diseases. Treatment never eradicates a disease, and it has to be a combination of prevention technologies. So we see ourselves as partners with the vaccine people, and indeed I worked on vaccines in the mid-'80s, and so that I think that that is something that we need to be partners in. Several non-for-profit organizations early on, in the late 80s, early 90s, started working on this mission, and they included the Pot Council, and Chris Elias is in the audience, and he was working on microbicides from the very beginning, and Conrad, and some very small biotech companies took on this mandate, but with very, very few resources. And we'll get into some of those issues later on, because Gordon told me not to say everything up front. So I won't. So anyway, now comes along 2002, and the Rockefeller Foundation, who had been an active supporter of microbicide work for a number of these organizations, felt that we needed to do more in the area of microbicides. And thus was formed the International Partnership for Microbicides, otherwise known as the IPM. And our main mission is to develop these products, as I said earlier. We need to increase the level of resources to the field as a whole so that we can develop these products in as timely a fashion as possible, to generate global stage advocacy for microbicides. It is clearly not a household word. Everyone understands the word vaccine, and I think that we have a lot of work to do to get our definition out there. To look across the field to identify the most promising candidates for microbicides, and there are a lot of different options, and to move them forward as rapidly as possible. We are incorporated as a 501c3. We are based just outside Washington in Silver Spring, Maryland. We are governed by a board of directors. We have several different silos in our organization. We are focused clearly on R&D, and in that way we act somewhat as a virtual pharmaceutical company. We are helping to prepare clinical sites throughout the developing world for the testing of these products, along with many other organizations. And importantly, we are preparing now for access to these products in the developing world. I'm sure most of you know the paradigm that it takes 10 to 15 years for a product that is approved here or in Europe to get to the developing world, and we need to turn that paradigm around. And so we need to start now to prepare for the introduction of these products without even having the products, which is clearly a challenge, but it is going to be essential. And so we are partnering with lots of other non-for-profits, with industry, both the pharmaceutical companies and the cosmetic industry, which is a very interesting partner for topical products for women. They get us to use things we don't need. Imagine what we can do for products that are life-saving. They did not like that when I first went to see them, and I told them that, but they've come around. And we also partner very, very closely with our donors and with many, many other organizations, global stage organizations such as the WHO and the UN. So that's who we are, and I will now turn it back over to Gordon and answer lots of questions later.
Thank you very much. Just list your major donors.
Yes. Oh, I meant to do that. Sorry.
That's right.
Rockefeller Foundation, and I'll do it in order of when they came in. The Rockefeller Foundation, the government of the Netherlands, the government of Ireland, the UK, Norway, Denmark, the World Bank, and UNFPA, and Gates Foundation.
That's right. And it's about 100 and...
I have about $100 million right now, give or take the pound. Yes.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn to my other panelist, Eugene Terry. Eugene is also, like Zeda, a virologist. Now, this is not Conway's rule number 7, that to have a partnership, you have to have a virologist. And apart from anything else, he's a plant virologist, which is different from a sort of human or animal virologist. And he, in fact, worked on another like obscure topic, barley yellow dwarf virus. So we all start with these discrete, fascinating topics and then go on to take on the world. He has worked in Africa for much of his working life in agriculture. He was for many years at the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture in Nigeria. He was famously Director General of WARDA, which is the West Africa Rice Development Agency in Ivory Coast, which, among other things, has been the pioneer of the new rices, which are sweeping through Africa right now, a tremendous achievement. He then went on to the World Bank, and he was the crops advisor in rural development to the World Bank, and retired on June the 11th 2002, and we got him to be Chief Executive of the African Agricultural Technology Foundation on June the 12th, 2002. That's what happens to you if you retire. Eugene, as I said, is now the CEO, interim CEO of the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, which is based in Nairobi, and I'm really particularly grateful for him having flown over from Nairobi to be with us. Eugene.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Let me first of all thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share with you what we've gone through in establishing this organization, this foundation. I want to publicly thank the Rockefeller Foundation through Gordon Conway, USAID and the United Kingdom's Department for International Development for the financial support that they provided in helping us create this foundation. I've asked the organizers to duplicate a brochure which I brought, which tells you a little bit more about the foundation. I hope you'll be able to pick a copy as we finish this topic. Let me say that I want to echo the sentiments of James Wolfenson last night when he indicated that behind these bland statistics that we hear are some very stark, desperate, and urgent problems in terms of hunger and poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Within the last 10 years or so, crop yields have increased by 27% in Asia, by 12% in Latin America, but they've decreased by 8% in sub-Saharan Africa. And we are told that perhaps there are as many as 194 million people who are in the category of those who are hungry and go on being hungry perpetually. Behind those statistics also lie the grim fact that there are about 40 million under 5 children who are malnourished. So this calls for some desperate and some urgent action. So who are we? We are a new and unique not-for-profit foundation that facilitates and promotes partnerships, public-private partnerships, such partnerships that we hope can remove many of the barriers to gaining access to existing agricultural technology. And here I'm talking about technologies writ large, chemical technology, mechanical technology, information technology, biotechnology. I stress this because I do not want to leave the impression that we are a biotechnology foundation. We are a technology transfer organization. So, what we are doing, or what we are about, in a word, we're about science and partnerships. We aim to become a one-stop shop for structuring and accessing agricultural technology and know-how. Again, in one word, we are the responsible party. We are there to help reduce transaction costs in the access and delivery of agricultural technology in the service of resource-poor farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. Our mission is to improve food security and reduce poverty of smallholder farmers, to identify and facilitate royalty-free transfers where this is appropriate, royalty-free transfers of proprietary technologies through negotiation. We are set up to enter into contractual agreements with existing institutions that will manage the deployment of the technologies that I mentioned that we are going to target. We also hope to structure our work so that we can ensure that the subsequent constraints that are faced by a range of stakeholders after access of technology are addressed as they are deployed. So this is all I want to say in terms of the introduction of what the AATF is, except that I should mention that we do have a board, an international board, and we do have what we are calling, we're making a distinction between investors and partners. Our investors, especially for the design phase, as I indicated before, the Rockefeller Foundation, the United States Agency for International Development, and DFID. Our partners include agricultural producers and consumers, regional, national institutions and agencies, especially the ones that have a Pan-African nature. NEPAD, the Economic Commission for Africa, the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, sub-regional organizations, and national agricultural research services. Our partners also include international institutes and agencies, like the CG centers. We work with local and international NGOs, and we work with agricultural technology, industry, intellectual property holders. So we have preliminary agreements with Monsanto, Dow Agro, Pioneer, DuPont, Syngenta, BASF. These are all companies that we've had initial conversations with, and in due time we will sign confidentiality agreements with them, and we will also do licensing and sub-licensing with them, where appropriate. So Gordon, I think this is enough just to say who we are.
Can I just ask you to give an example of one technology that illustrates what you're about, a technology that is privately owned and you wish to get access to it?
Our board has approved 8 problem areas, strategic problem areas for sub-Saharan Africa, food security and hunger, that if those strategic areas are not tackled, we will continue to have persistent hunger and poverty because the production constraints that affect these strategic crops are such that they will continue to reduce production and productivity. These 8 areas deal with mostly our staple crops: maize, rice, sorghum, millet, bananas, plantains, cassavas. One intractable problem that has plagued cereals in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in areas where soil fertility is low and where drought is a problem, is something called striga, which is a parasitic plant. Striga is a particularly vicious weed. It invades the roots of plants. At the same time, when it germinates and when the seed of the crop germinates, the striga germinates, and its roots penetrate the roots of the crop that we want to harvest from. It affects maize, it affects cereals, it affects cowpeas. We have been able to have an agreement, a tentative agreement with a company that has produced a herbicide-tolerant variety of maize, and at the same time, a herbicide that can kill the striga. It's a very elegant approach at the control of striga. You coat the maize seeds with the herbicide, you plant the maize. At germination, there's an exudate from the maize that will stimulate the striga to germinate. As soon as the striga germinates, before it can penetrate the maize roots, it is killed by the herbicide. This is a proprietary technology. It is one that we believe has far-reaching implications for control of this very devastating weed, and we are negotiating with both the company and another stakeholder to have the license to commercialize both the gene in the seed and the herbicide. So that is one very elegant way to control a problem, and where there are some obstacles to resource-poor farmers having access to this technology, but we believe our interventions will make that possible.
Thank you, Eugene. Now, 20 years ago, we would expect that government would be doing this, or the private sector would be doing this. Well, why not? I mean, why is it, Zeda, that we can't just leave this to the governments or to the private sector to produce these microbicides? What's the failure there?
First of all, for drug development, government agencies don't do drug development. Pharmaceutical companies do drug development. The NIH, at which I worked for many years, is a research institution, and it supports very good research that can lead to the identification of novel drugs, and it is moving more into helping move these products down a pipeline, but that is not their mission. Their mission is general research, that you can't kind of know in advance what its end product will lead to. So drug development has traditionally been in the realm of the drug companies. And for microbicides specifically, and for products in general where the majority of the use will be in the developing world, there is not perceived to be a sufficient paying market to justify the investment costs that it takes to develop a product. And it is very costly to develop a product, even a blockbuster drug. And it can cost upwards of, $800 million, to $1 billion to get some of these products to the market, because it takes into account the cost of failure. And failure is an accepted part of drug development. You lose products at every stage of drug development because they don't meet the different criteria to move them forward. And especially for HIV prevention products, which are to be used in healthy women and healthy individuals in general, the risk-benefit calculation has to be incredibly in favor of the benefits. It's one thing when you're treating a life-threatening disease and someone will die if you don't give them the drug. Here these women are uninfected, and so the safety of these products has to be paramount, as well as the effectiveness. And so the drug companies have perceived this as too great a risk. And there are a number of other issues because microbicides are a new product class. Drug companies can estimate markets for vaccines, they can estimate markets for different personal care products. They can't estimate the market for a microbicide since it's never been in existence before. And they don't want to take that risk. And they also, because it's a new product class, the regulatory issues of how to get a product on the market through regulatory agencies are not well worked out. And that usually is a huge effort for companies, even when the regulatory pathway is well worked out. And so this is another issue that they are concerned about, the risks and liabilities. And the third is these products have to be tested for effectiveness or efficacy in the developing world, because that's where most of the HIV transmission is occurring. And it is very difficult to do studies according to good clinical practices, harmonization guidelines around the world in settings where the infrastructure is so bad. So all of us who are working on clinical sites and clinical trials have had to invest a lot of resources into infrastructure and capacity building, which can be done. It is only a matter of resources. The technical capacity there in terms of people willing and able to do these trials is enormous. They just need the resources to be able to establish the clinics and do all of the training to be able to carry these out, as well as all the laboratory capacity. So for all of those reasons, private sector has really stood back. And what we anticipate is that once a first-generation product is out there and the market can be established, and we've proven that you can get it through regulatory pathways, and we've proven that you can do the trials, that's when they'll step in.
Gene, let me ask you the same question. I mean, when we had the Green Revolution, it was effectively done by public agencies, by government. Why can't we simply repeat that for Africa?
With the dimensions of the problems that I stated before in terms of the deficit in food production and food productivity, it is clear that what we need to do is to harness the best practices, the assets, and the resources of both the public and the private sector. The public sector investment in the kinds of technologies which could address some of the problems that I referred to in my opening remarks, those resources are declining, and the private sector's investments are accelerating at a very, very advanced stage. Indeed, quite a few of these technologies are now owned by the private sector, and that is not a bad thing. It is the need to harness the resources of both entities that has driven the creation of this foundation. Let me state some of the things that kept these two sectors apart in the past and that impeded the exploitation of the potential for synergies between these two sectors. First was that the sectors were motivated by fundamentally different incentives. My colleague has just stated the interest of the private sector, the profit-making motive, and the public sector clearly dedicated to international public goods. So we needed to bring these two parties together and to find common ground. There's also the persistent negative perceptions of each other. The public sector believes that the private sector is too dominated, again, by the profit motive and do not behave in a way that is commensurate with those that have the corporate responsibility, corporate citizenship responsibility. This is not true, but this is a perception, and in some cases, the perceptions are much more powerful than the reality. There have been a lack of creative organizational mechanisms on how to avoid and to reduce the competition for assets between the private sector and the public sector. The human capacity that is required to tackle some of these problems is one such area. And the final one, for me, and this is something that I'm not bashful about, and I believe the Rockefeller has given us some inspiration on that, is that there are no real models, and we are creating our own models. And this particular model states that this foundation will be Africa-owned and Africa-led, and will focus uniquely on African problems, because I believe it is about time that the Africans take their destiny into their own hands, make their own mistakes, own their own problems, and own the solutions. So these are the fundamental pillars of this, and this is why we're looking at a model different from what may have been tried before.
I think that's fascinating. Let me just add one other piece of information here. At the time of the Green Revolution, a lot of the innovativeness came from the universities, particularly land-grant universities here in the United States. They're still innovative. 40% of all the agricultural patents in the last few years have been produced in public sector institutions, in particular in the universities. But what have the universities done? They've sold the whole lot to the private sector. And one of the partnerships that we've also created is between American universities, which is to hold back the rights to this patented material for use in developing countries, and interestingly, for specialty crops in this country. For example, for specialty crops here in California. It's an interesting phenomenon that we're seeing, but it backs up Gene's point that so much of the new technology is now in the hands of the private sector, and it has to be unlocked in this way. Let me ask, again, both of you, about your relationships with the private sector. I mean, what is it you've learned about the dealings? But in particular, what I'm interested in is, what does the private sector think they're getting out of this? I think, Zeda, you mentioned one benefit, and that is they can see that microbicides might work. You've got a proof of concept role. You're doing some R&D for them. But what other things are they getting out of it? What do they think they're getting out of it?
Well, I think to some degree there's the kind of public relations benefit. The pharmaceutical industry has really taken it on the chin with regarding to pricing of drugs, especially for HIV infection. And I think they see this as a way to not just make amends, but to give something back. I mean, when I was in the NIH and would try to engage pharma in discussions of different products that were coming to us from the public sector, from academics, and I would go and meet with them and say, you know, you really want to do this? And they would say, we really don't want to do this. And it was then the liability issues were everything that they just kept putting out on the table. And they said, you know, when you talk to some of the lawyers and you get them off record, and they would say that, well, if this were a blockbuster drug, or the potential for a blockbuster in terms of money, then the liability issues pale because the potential profits offset the liability. So what's been happening now since the IPM was created, and now I can go and sit at some of those same tables, but with money behind me, then the conversation actually begins, and they can see that we can truly offset some of their liabilities. We can carry out some of the clinical trials. And we are a terrible target for lawsuits because as a non-for-profit, we just are easier in that way. And so they feel that we can truly offset some of the liabilities. And they also realize, and we've been very clear with them, that we need them. We need their active agents. These are some of the products that have been shelved for development because they were not very good systemic drugs. Well, we don't want systemic drugs, we want topical drugs. So that is exactly what we need. And they are willing now at least to go through their shelves and see what it is that they didn't want to develop and give us the licenses for those. Even some of the products that they're developing as systemic therapeutics, they are still willing to look at them as topicals as long as we can assume a lot of the liability. And the discussions that we've had have been very productive in terms of getting all the IP that we need to operate with total freedom in the developing world, and also are trying to negotiate with some success such that if this does have a market in the US or in Europe, and they want those rights back to develop it in the developed world, they can, and they pay us a royalty, and then they also pay us back for some of the development costs. And I think that that is really a very good partnership. And so we are kind of sitting at the table more as doing traditional deals than as I would have under the NIH.
Sure. Gene, same question. The company that's got the ownership of the herbicide resistance, what are they getting out of it?
Gordon, you've given me another example, another opportunity to be less bashful about some realities. One reality that we are not bashful about in this foundation is to state clearly at the outset that whatever the companies want to get out of this association is their business. But where there's convergence between what they want to get out of this association and what we in Africa want to get out of it, we're in business with these companies. So let me start off by saying that our two pillars here are access to technology and the delivery of the technology. The access part could be very easy because it's based on negotiation. The delivery part has a lot of transaction costs. And I mentioned in my opening statement that we and the company have been looking for, and the companies have been looking for a one-stop shop that reduces transaction costs. Clearly, the companies do not want to have to do business with 52 different biosafety regulatory organizations in sub-Saharan Africa. They do not want to be responsible for all of the demonstration trials and tests that have to be done to see whether their product is adaptable. Clearly, the company wants to be, as I say, a responsible corporate citizen and want to contribute to development efforts globally. And therefore, where there's no competition for a commercial product, they're willing to provide some of these technologies on a humanitarian basis. So all of these go together to make a very important contribution to addressing some very substantial food security and poverty alleviation issues that we face. One of the things that we hope the companies will quickly see is that subsistence farmers in Africa will not continue to be subsistent forever. They will eventually self-organize to exploit the potentials that advanced technologies will bring and will become markets. And I don't think this is lost on the companies. So there are very many potentials here for a win-win situation. And I have been very, very pleased and encouraged with the willingness within which the companies are ready to talk to us. And you know you're making progress when about the second or third time you meet with the companies and they say, before we say anything at this meeting, we're going to have to sign a confidentiality agreement. That means that they're ready to do a deal. And I like your description of one of our targets. We are in the business of deal making, and we're not bashful about that.
What about success? How do you measure success? When do you think you're beginning to feel successful? Zeda.
Our ultimate success is having a product marketed, but it doesn't have to be our product. It can be anyone's product. I mean, the goal is to move anyone who is working on microbicides along as quickly as possible with promising products to get them to the market as soon as possible. So our measure of success can be quite global because there are a number of things that the partnership is doing that can serve as resources for the field as a whole. I mean, one of the issues that pertain to microbicides specifically that do not pertain to oral drugs or IV drugs is that these are topical formulations. And as such, there's actually not a whole lot of expertise around the world in how to deliver something topically for long periods of time in conjunction with sex. Or at least for that women will use this over long periods of time. Acceptability is a huge issue for microbicides. It's unlike a drug for a topical for treatment of yeast or trichomoniasis where you're symptomatic and you'll put up with something for a couple days in order to feel better. But this is something that you're supposed to use all the time when you feel okay already. So one thing that we're doing is setting up a formulation platform, and we already have set it up with experts in formulation design that can work with anyone's active ingredient and formulate it for a variety of different ways. So that's something that we hope to give to the field as a whole. A lot of the knowledge that we will generate will be with partners and all of it will be publicly accessible. So that the goal is to move everyone along, and other partners are doing their share in moving things along and sharing it with us. So I think that that's the nature of a partnership that can help raise the whole level of research in general. I think success ultimately will that we're not needed anymore, or that we transform our R&D effort into a total access effort, and how to get these products out there, how to work with the financing people and the procurement people and the distribution people, partnering with companies like Coca-Cola and Unilever to get these products on the backs of trucks, because you can find Coke in every remote village everywhere, so maybe you can get microbicides out there as well. You know, put a healthcare worker on every Coke truck. There are lots of innovative ways of getting things out there, so hopefully we can transform from an R&D effort to a total access effort, because we will be obsolete and the pharmaceutical industry will take over, which would be the nice thing to do. So that's kind of our different measures of success, and clearly along the way, because our donors keep asking us, what did you do this year? It will be setting up very crucial deals to get products on board, and to show that we have made movement along the traditional product development milestones. We have our Gantt charts, we know where we're supposed to be, and so there are kind of, you know, concrete interim measures of success, but there's the ultimate measure of success that will be obsolete.
And that's probably 10 years, 7 years, 8 years?
10? Kind of.
10 kind of years. By the way, that's a tough one for donors. Claire Short, as you remember, used to be the British Secretary for International Development. She is still prominent in the news, as you know. And she's been a funder of IPM from the beginning, and I remember seeing her about 6 months after she'd given the first amount, and she buttonholed me in the way that she does and says, "Gordon, when are you getting these microbicides out to the women who need them?" And I suddenly realized she didn't actually understand what it was we were doing. And I said, well, it's going to take maybe, you know, if we're really lucky, 7 years, so it's 8, 9, or 10 years. And that's tough. It's tough for politicians, tough for all of us.
Someone actually gave me a great analogy when I was in Europe and we were announcing the IPM to a lot of our donors, and the question was asked, how can you sustain interest in the donors over a long period of time? And a member of the audience, Peggy Johnston from the NIH, said, well, why don't we think about the building of a cathedral? We're here in Europe, we were in Antwerp, all these beautiful cathedrals, and they don't get built overnight. And someone who starts a cathedral thinks of a legacy for the world, and it goes through multiple generations. And so she said microbicides could be the next cathedral. So I thought that was actually a really good response.
That's rather nice. And you could sell off bits of it, you know, a gargoyle here.
That's right. Exactly.
An axe over there.
Yeah.
I like that.
So did I.
Gene, are you building a cathedral? Don't answer that.
I'm not going to. Let me start off by saying I think this kind of an organism, this kind of an initiative is going to have to be in business for quite a while because of the challenges that we face. We would measure successes at different levels of stakeholders. Obviously, at the level of the resource-poor farmers, when we get the product to farmers' fields and they begin to reduce their food insecurity and begin to generate income from that crop as a result of that technological intervention, that would be a measure of success. At the level of the scientist, who is an equal partner in this, in trying to get the technology to the farmer. And by the scientists, I mean the scientists in the public domain, in the public sector. You know you're making progress when scientists stop talking about an interesting research topic and start talking about a usable product. Then you know you're making progress. So we're beginning to see some of that happening. With the seed companies, if they come after this organization and say, we know that the only way we can get our hands on these new technologies is to sign a sub-license with you, is to have an agreement with you, you know you're making progress. And with the companies, as I indicated before, if after a couple of visits you begin to hear talk about well, let's see what we may have in the pipeline for this. Then you know that perhaps the companies are beginning to appreciate the very important role that an organism like this can play in the strategic areas of technology transfer, which would include licensing, sub-licensing, the development of regulatory frameworks and dossiers, which are very expensive, biosafety regimes. These are all things that are going to continue to be part of the continuum of activities in the value chain from discovery to end users. And it is important that these activities be handled by organizations that know precisely what they're doing and can reduce the transaction costs and look after the concerns of the end users as well as the technology providers. The liability issues will continue to be issues that will face us and them. And so it's important. And so when an organization like Rockefeller puts some money on the table and say, this will facilitate the work of this foundation, this is extremely important, and this is what we're looking for in the other partnerships that we're trying to form. Organizations that will continue to help with the financial side of running an institution like this, because it does have some very serious cost implications for these partnerships.
Thank you, Eugene. I'm going to open to the floor in just a minute, but I just want to add another example of a partnership which illustrates the kind of learning that goes on in these partnerships. And this is called MTCT+. As many of you know, women who are HIV positive are likely to pass on the virus to their infants at birth. But you can prevent this, often very simply, by providing a single pharmaceutical, nevirapine, at the time of birth. But one of the problems then is you save the child, the mother then dies, and crudely, you're creating orphans. So a couple of years ago, a number of foundations got together to launch this program called MTCT+. Ourselves, Gates, Starr, MacArthur, Robert Wood Johnson, 2 or 3 other foundations. And we managed to get together 50 million from between us all. And we now have 12 sites in Africa where women come to antenatal clinics, and when they're diagnosed as being HIV positive, they're guaranteed treatment for the rest of their lives. And it's been running for a year, but really effectively for only 6 months. And the results are already really quite startling. We said to the women when they discovered they're HIV positive, go back, tell your man, your husband, your partner, tell him the news and get him to come and enroll too. And we thought, you know, that's tough. We thought this wouldn't happen. And over a quarter of all the people receiving treatment on this program are now men. And the women, of course, are also enrolling the other children who are HIV positive. The other piece of news is that those who get the antiretroviral treatment, the adherence to the treatment is 97%. It's better than it is here in the United States. So one of the crucial achievements of that partnership is to dispel these myths, dispel this idea that Africa's hopeless, we can't do anything about HIV/AIDS. And last week we heard that the Bush government has put in 125 million extra into this partnership. It's a very good example of how you can lever up and up by doing something in the right way. Okay, open to questions, comments to the panelists or on the general issue, hundreds of them. A microphone somewhere, I know. Lady at the front here. It's coming up behind you. You can't throw lemons, I'm sorry.
Delighted that we're talking about microbicides that have lemons on the table.
I'm not sure I get the...
I do.
I
do. I'm ready.
My name is
I'm not
Dr.
sure I want to go there. Do you want to go there?
Yes, I'm going to explain it. I'm Julia Walsh. I'm director of the Berkeley International Health Group at UC Berkeley, which is a multidisciplinary group that does policy analysis and trainings about how to use the limited resources in developing countries to maximize health benefits. Well, my question and concern is about lemons. Lemons have a 400-year history of traditional kind of informal use to prevent conception, and have recently been, this is in the vagina, and word has passed through women. Casanova first wrote about it, and now has been determined by Roger Short in Australia that it is just has wonderful impact on HIV. Immediately in contact with lemon juice, the viruses and sperm kind of just almost, they stop.
They die.
Yes. Now, this has no license. We have, in fact, some partners of ours are now looking at lemon juice and its potential effect on other STIs, other infectious microorganisms. And we've also done some studies on, and it's widely used in at least Nigeria by female sex workers they think it increases their throughput of clients, but with no health impact that they can note. But it doesn't have a license on it. It has no intellectual property rights. And my question is, number one, about it would seem like with this kind of long history, it would be dynamite to invest in looking at this and doing effectiveness studies. But in fact, the studies have had trouble getting funded. But there is no private company who's invested in lemons. There's no sub-licensing agreements that are possible for lemons. There was a recent New York Times article in the magazine about copyrights, in fact, and intellectual property rights may be interfering with the creative process. So those are my two questions are, what are you doing about lemons? And do you think that something like these traditional medicines, which have no licensing, no intellectual property rights, may in fact be lost in something like these partnerships?
We've had many conference calls on lemons. The issue on lemons is potential harm. Okay? The vaginal pH is low. I mean, the normal vaginal pH is about pH 4.5, which is acidic. It is not nearly as acidic as lemons, however. The one rule of product development is cause no harm, clinical trials, et cetera. There is serious concern that lemons could cause harm. Now, just because something has been used for eons and eons doesn't mean that it actually will work in the context of HIV, because anything that interferes with the normal vaginal epithelium. The normal vagina at a regular pH it's actually very difficult to transmit HIV. We are very fortunate that it is as poorly transmitted as it is. If HIV were as easily transmitted as herpes or gonorrhea or chlamydia, we would have lost Africa by now. Okay? So it is very difficult to transmit because there are normal vaginal mechanisms to prevent infection with a lot of pathogens. Okay? If you screw that up in any way, you can then enhance infection. And that is some of the concern that may have happened with one of the first microbicides being tested, nanoxynol 9, which was a spermicide. It is on the market for prevention of pregnancy. But when used consistently and multiple times a day by sex workers in conjunction with every sex act, it caused very bad irritation and ulceration, and at least some of the trends in the data showed that it was an increased risk of HIV infection in those women using N9. So we have to be incredibly careful. There are standard studies that you have to do to show whether something is irritating or not. And Roger Short and others we've said, you can't go into a clinical study. They wanted to skip all the clinical studies completely and say, let's just market it, it's out there. That is incredibly dangerous to do. So there is a classic pathway, and many organizations, USAID and others, were saying we'll be happy to test this in a classic pathway. And the answer was it'll take too long and women are dying. That is true, but the potential for harm is such that you cannot shortcut traditional product development pathways. Okay? Safety is paramount. And those safety studies are actually incredibly cheap to do, or relatively cheap.
The general point, though, I think is a valid one, that there are traditional medicines that are useful. The big example is treatment of the fungal infections that come along with HIV. And there are a number in Africa of traditional medicines that are being effectively used in that way. So I don't think those are being wiped out. I mean, I don't think that we're necessarily wiping those out. Now, I had the gentleman at the back, and I'll try and get everybody in, please.
Philanthropic partnerships, and we fund innovative research into cures for catastrophic diseases. I really appreciate the roadmap that you've laid out for us on partnerships. And in fact, for those of you that have gotten a copy of the Wall Street Journal today, there's a wonderful article about private investment into Harvard University for stem cell research, which really validates this concept. I've got two questions for you. One concerns competition. All of these decentralized individuals and groups that are working on these problems tend to take a very personal, sort of egotistical and competitive look at this. Do you have any advice as to how you can use your role as a catalyst and bring these different groups together? Secondly, the question about entrepreneurial development, which is that other wonderful word that you talked about. As these products become developed, how can we help develop the entrepreneurial capacity, particularly in places like Africa, to bring these products to market? And I think building up that entrepreneurial infrastructure is critical, and I thought you might have some advice on that as well.
Well, just on the first one, I mean, I'll answer in a sense for Zeda. I mean, part of the purpose of the IPM is to bring some order to the microbicide development. I think there are something like 50 microbicides being developed, is that right?
There are about 50 in the pipeline, yeah.
So about 50 in the pipeline. And part of what the IPM is doing is bringing some order to that process to reduce the competition and increase the collaboration. Why don't you say something about the encouragement of entrepreneurship in Africa?
Let me start off by saying that I think we all believe and really appreciate the fact that our governments, instead of facilitating the enabling environment for entrepreneurs, impede and stifle them. So that is one area where reforms need to be very quickly done. So that's on the government side. But I believe, as I stated earlier, that what we would like to do, and we are learning by doing, because again, there are no models for this, is to see how we could facilitate the self-organization of interested groups to capitalize on the commercial value of some of these products once their food security needs are met. And I don't think there's any shortage of talent and resourcefulness among the prospective entrepreneurs. I think what is missing is the enabling environment, the reforms, the laws, the infrastructure, the transportation, the markets. Those are the areas that we need to work. And this foundation clearly will be doing work that is tangential to some of these things, but some of our work will be directed at this. Again, we're learning by doing, and I cannot quote you any success stories at this time because we've only been in existence for just over a year, and we are now in the process of getting these products in the hands of those who need them.
Just one example, a new technology is tissue-cultured bananas, bananas for staple food. And if you now go through Uganda and Kenya, you'll find all over the place women who've set up little nurseries of tissue-cultured bananas and are selling on the suckers to all their neighbors in the village. I mean, you get a technology that really works. They're producing 50 tons per hectare of bananas, these new tissue culture bananas. When that happens, people latch onto it, and they set up their little businesses and they start to work. Madam, you had your hand up in the front here, and I was going to take, afterwards you, Klaus, and there was somebody over there and there was somebody over there, but that's going to be it, I'm afraid. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. My name is Claudine Mitchali. I work for the South African Consulate in Los Angeles. My question is for Mr. Terry. This has to do with the realities and the challenges faced by individual hunger, commercial markets, globalization, and international politics. You all are aware that in Africa, most of those governments have preferential trade treaties with the EU, the European Union, rather than the US. And so the issue of genetically modified crops is a major issue. It might solve the immediate question of hunger, but when you look at the long-term issue of how does the country at large benefit from that preferential trade treaty, it's a very difficult question. So my question to you, Mr. Terry, is what does the foundation do with regard to the downstream political issue of the EU not allowing genetically modified crops into that market?
How much time do we have?
Short answer, Eugene. There's 3 more questions.
Let me start off by saying that one of the things that we need to do fairly quickly is to develop a robust capacity to assess risks and benefits of any advanced technologies that are going to be introduced anywhere in the world, but clearly in sub-Saharan Africa. This capacity does not exist at this time. So what you find is a host of various interpretations of what are the problems, what are the risks, what are the benefits. Most of the people who speak on behalf of the Africans either are speaking with a full stomach or do not know what they're talking about. So that is one of the things that we're going to have to try to do. Provide policymakers and entrepreneurs and farmers and users with as much information about the risk and benefit of these technologies on a case-by-case basis, because I don't think there are any generic issues here. Most of the issues are specific issues. And the second issue we've got to come to terms with is that some of the controversies surrounding living modified organisms are not about science. They're about consumer acceptance and they're about trade. And where we can at least influence decision-making, either positively or negatively, by providing precise information where precise information exists. This is what we must do. Where we have no control over the trade issues, and right now I believe the trade issues are essentially between the United States and the European Union. Although I believe that there are moves to begin to resolve those trade issues, I think it is unfortunate that Africa gets caught in the middle of that trade issue, because one of the downside of that is that it begins to appear like an anti-science movement at a time when Africa needs to use as much science and technology to address its own problems. So again, I go back to what I believe is absolutely fundamental, and that is that there should be enough people who know the science and who know what are the implications and the risks and the benefits of these before we begin to make judgments and decisions on them. The governments are sovereign governments, and they can make the decisions once they have the information.
Just when you go away, don't take with you the impression that the herbicide-resistant maize that Eugene talked about is genetically modified. It is not a genetically modified maize. Klaus.
My name is Klaus Leisinger. I'm the president and CEO of the Novartis Foundation, and I want to make two comments. First, in conjunction to what you just said and what the lady from South Africa said, we had initiated a project in Kenya that involved, amongst others, genetically modified organisms. And, you know, the biggest problem we had to overcome was that we had antagonism from European NGOs on the very hardcore political side, with insinuations, with slander, with all kind of things that make corporate willingness to give something away waning, to say the least. If you look at what would be possible with the golden rice, if you go to the European Greenpeace site, it still says there you have to eat 7 kilos to get what you need. Everybody who wants to know knows it's less than 300 grams. In such a situation, you are here on the United States side in a much better position. This political antagonism between NGOs and the private sector is far less pronounced. Maybe the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, but this is how I perceive it. The point that I wanted to say to Zeda is, if I ask the Novartis research department, how do you allocate money? They say there are 140 diseases, about 70 we can deal with drugs. For 35 we know the chemical compounds, 19 we have in our own house, 9 have superior, and 3 have a multi-billion turnover potential. There we go. That we will not be able to change. But that means that there is intellectual property higher up that is not going to be developed for marketing reasons, for focusing reasons. And that brings me to an idea of what Gordon Conway is going to do 1st of January 2006. And that is a consultative group on international health research. Because if you look at the health side, what CGIAR did, a lot of companies might be willing to give intellectual property that they are not willing to develop, that they don't, for what reason soever, but the research is already done, the products are already there, somebody waits for it to be developed, and if you would have 6 or 7 centers like the CGIAR is having, focusing on the 6 or 7 most important diseases, and we could put public money and the National Academy of Science of different countries together, companies would be willing to give intellectual property for just that. Thank you.
I'm not going to let you, I'm just going to get one more question in and then get a quick comment for both of you. And then we have to stop. I'm sorry.
Thanks.
No?
I'm Con Nugent from New York. I'm sorry.
Okay. It's not the last question.
I'm Con Nugent from New York, J.M. Kaplan Fund, and I want to thank the panel. This has been a very provocative and most informative presentation. I have a question that's based on Dr. Terry's problematic of agriculture in Africa, rising population, declining agricultural productivity, exacerbated by problems of soil fertility, drought, and a potential, at least partial solution in the development of an ingenious new herbicide-resistant seed of maize. My question is, what might be a partnership that worries about the soil fertility? That is to say, what is the capacity for partnerships as structured along the lines that the panel has been describing for difficult, long-term, if you will, natural infrastructural considerations like soil fertility, like water adequacy. This isn't a question of whether something is a genetically engineered organism or not. It really is talking about how can we structure partnerships that can protect natural legacies so that generations as yet on board, as they say, might be able to use them later on.
Thank you. I'll answer your question in 2 ways. First and foremost, we're going to be looking for novel approaches to solving these problems. And I wanted to echo what Gordon said, that we have strategically identified the problem areas that need to be tackled. And these problem areas are not only going to be tackled just by technological interventions. There are going to have to be other interventions in terms of reforms, infrastructure, institution building, capacity building. Now, specifically for those areas and those crops where productivity is declining as a result of a multitude of problems, including soil fertility, including drought, where technological interventions, advanced technological interventions will work, these will be applied. But as I indicated, we are going to be in partnerships with other organizations that are addressing some of these problems. We are in partnership, for example, with the CG centers, and you know, of course, that there's the International Center for Research in Agroforestry that is dealing with soil fertility replenishment. And there's a joint project using some of the advanced technology for striker control with soil fertility enhancement to see if together you can bring synergies to attack the problems. I know that's where your question is leading, and let me assure you that as far as we are concerned, every type of technological intervention that can bring a solution to those problems will be utilized. We are not shutting the door.
Let me just go back to Klaus's question. The word CG gets out, and CGIAR, many of you probably don't quite know what that means. Basically, in agriculture, there are, I can't remember how many it is now, 16 different institutes around the world, one for rice, one for wheat and maize, one for potatoes, and so on, that do all the research. And the point is, could we not create, and they all gather together under something called the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which we call CGIAR or the CG. All of those in the know, as it were, use the acronyms that way. And what Klaus is saying is, can't you do the same thing for health? I'm skeptical about that, in part because I think that old model of rather large institutions, somewhat bureaucratic, is not what we need today. I think that eventually we will have not just IPM and the vaccine initiative and the medicine for malaria initiative, but a whole range of these public-private partnerships. And they, in turn, will create a universe of research. It'll be a different style of doing it, but it'll be something rather equivalent to the CGIAR in the future. There was somebody, the person who had his hand up has now not got his hand up, so I will take you, madam, in the front here, in the primrose top, the lemon top. It could be harmful for you, so watch it.
Thank you. My name's Eleanor Fink, and I'm the coordinator for partnerships with foundations at the World Bank. And again, I wanted to thank the panel for an interesting discussion and presentation on how we can structure partnerships effectively based on bringing in the public-private and community partnerships. There was one piece of the equation that I thought was particularly important, and it was brought out by Eugene Terry, and that is that his foundation is Africa-led and owned. And I think that's an element that we should all be thinking about much more deeply and see how we can work together to help promote philanthropy in developing countries, to convince governments to create an enabling environment for it. Money alone is never going to be the answer. If we are able to collect resources in developing countries where we're trying to solve problems, to address the self-help, it could make an enormous difference.
I think that's a very good point. I think there are several people working on that. Bruce Shearer, I know, is here from Synergos, and of course they've been doing a great deal of work with encouraging developing country philanthropy. And I'd also just like to mention the great role that the bank plays in partnerships. We have, and it echoes your point about building African capacity, we have a major partnership between ourselves, the Carnegie Corporation, and the World Bank in developing Makerere as a major university in Africa. I'm going to be there next week. I think that between us, it's something of the order of $20 million is going in there to the university, but what, under an incredibly dynamic and energetic Vice Chancellor, Professor Sibawufu, and an extraordinarily dedicated staff, Makerere is rising like a phoenix from the ashes, and I think it's a great tribute to the bank in coming in as a partner on this. I've got a big sign that says TIME, which is not an acronym for, but could be. And I'm afraid we have to come to an end. I just want you to join me in thanking these two quite remarkable panelists. And wish them well. 10 years from now, when we have the next forum to look at the results, we'll all be handed out little jars of microbicide.